My name is Emily, and I will never forget this day. It must have been the most beautiful of my life. It was a Saturday in June, and the sun shone on the little church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where I was about to marry Thomas, the man I had loved for 5 years. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut roses, and soft music drifted from the open doors of the church. I stood in a small back room, nervously adjusting my veil in front of a full-length mirror. My best friend Sophie was helping me smooth out the wrinkles in my dress. My heart was racing. A mixture of excitement and anxiety coursed through me. I had waited so long for this moment, and now that it was here, I felt overwhelmed with emotion. "You look beautiful, Emily," Sophie said, placing her hands on my shoulders. "Thomas will be dazzled." I smiled at her in the mirror, grateful for her reassuring presence. We had known each other since high school, and she had been by my side through every important moment in my life. Today was no exception. Suddenly, we heard a commotion coming from the church entrance. Voices rose, growing louder and louder. Sophie and I exchanged a worried look. "What's going on?" I whispered, feeling my stomach drop. Sophie opened the door a crack to peek outside. "I don't know," she said, looking perplexed. "There's a crowd near the entrance." My father, who was supposed to walk me down the aisle, appeared at the door, his face pale. "Emily, my darling," he said softly, "there is a problem." Before I could ask what it was, the door burst open. Martina, Thomas's mother, stormed into the room, her face red with anger, her eyes flashing. "You," she shouted, pointing at me. "How dare you?" I took a step back, shocked by the hostility in her voice. "Madame Leblanc," I stammered. "What's going on?" "Don't play innocent with me," she screamed. "You stole my emerald ring, the one my grandmother left me." Silence filled the small room. I felt everyone's eyes turn toward me, my heart pounding even harder, this time with fear and confusion. I don't understand," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "I have never seen your ring, Madame Leblanc." But Martine didn't want to hear anything. She continued to accuse me, her voice carrying through the church. I could hear the murmurs of the guests, their whispers of concern. Then Thomas appeared at the door, his face serious. His eyes moved from his mother to me, confusion etched into his expression. "Emily," he said in a tense voice, "is that true?" I felt my heart break at the doubt in his voice. How could he believe I was capable of such a thing? "Thomas," I pleaded, tears welling in my eyes, "I swear I didn't do anything. I never saw that ring." But the damage was done. Doubt had crept into his gaze. I saw it in his eyes, in the faces of the guests who had gathered at the doorway. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of confusion and pain. Martine's accusations grew harsher, more relentless. Thomas remained silent, his gaze flickering between his mother and me, unable to take a side. I felt trapped, cornered. How had we gotten here? How had this day, meant to be the happiest of my life, turned into a nightmare? Sophie tried to defend me, tried to calm the situation, but her voice was lost in the chaos. My father stayed by my side, a protective hand on my shoulder. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice cold, distant, so different from the man I loved. "Emily, if you took the ring, give it back now. Otherwise, the wedding is cancelled." His words hit me like a punch. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man I loved, the man who was supposed to be my husband in just a few minutes, was now threatening to call off our marriage over unfounded accusations. "Thomas," I begged, tears streaming down my face, "I swear I don't have that ring. I've never even seen it. How can you doubt me?" But my words seemed to vanish into thin air. Thomas's gaze was hard, influenced by his mother's accusations and perhaps by his own lingering doubts. The guests were growing restless. I heard their murmurs, their speculations. Some sided with me, others with Martine. The joy and love that should have filled this day had been replaced by suspicion and judgment. I felt alone, betrayed, humiliated. How could I prove my innocence? How could I convince Thomas, the man I loved more than anything, that I had done nothing wrong? The minutes dragged on endlessly, each second deepening the rift between us. I saw our future, our dreams, our plans crumbling before my eyes. Finally, unable to bear the situation any longer, I made a decision. With all the dignity I could muster, I turned to Thomas. "If you can't trust me today," I said, my voice trembling but firm, "then maybe we shouldn't get married at all." A heavy silence fell over the room. I saw the shock on Thomas's face, but I couldn't back down. He needed to understand how much his mistrust was hurting me. Without waiting for his response, I turned to my father and Sophie. "Take me away from here," I whispered. As we moved toward the exit, I heard Thomas call my name, but I didn't turn around. My heart was shattered, my trust broken. The happiest day of my life had turned into my worst nightmare. As I left the church, I felt the sun on my face, a cruel contrast to the storm raging in my heart. I didn't know what the future held for me, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. I found myself in front of Saint-Germain's PR church, my heart in pieces and my mind in disarray. The June sun, which only minutes earlier had seemed so promising, now felt cruelly indifferent to my distress. Passers-by stared, intrigued by the sight of a bride crying on the church steps. I must have looked pitiful. Sophie held me by the shoulders, gently leading me away from the entrance. My father, his face serious, tried to disperse the curious onlookers who had begun to gather. Inside the church, I could still hear echoes of the argument, Martin's shrill voice dominating all the others. "Come, Emily," Sophie whispered. "Let's go somewhere quieter." I let myself be guided like an automaton to a small cafe just a few steps away. The owner, noticing my state, quickly seated us in a quiet corner, away from prying eyes. I collapsed into a chair, unable to hold back my sobs any longer. "How could he do this to me?" I cried, my hands trembling. "How could he doubt me?" Sophie hugged me, whispering comforting words I could barely hear. Across from me, my father sat with a face full of suppressed anger. "My dear," he said softly, "we all know you didn't do anything wrong. That woman is crazy, and Thomas should have defended you." His words, though meant to comfort me, only deepened the pain in my chest. Yes, Thomas should have defended me. He should have believed in me, in us. But he hadn't. Suddenly, the cafe door burst open. Thomas stood there, out of breath, his eyes red. My heart leapt, a painful mix of hope and fear. "Emily," he said, approaching our table. "We need to talk." My father jumped up, placing himself between Thomas and me. "I think you've done enough, boy," he growled. But I put a hand on my father's arm. I needed to hear what Thomas had to say. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would finally believe me. "It's okay, Dad," I said weakly. "Let him talk." Thomas approached hesitantly. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his love for me and his duty to his family. "Emily," he began, "I'm sorry about what happened at the church. My mother, she's upset. That ring means a lot to her." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything that had just happened, he was still justifying his mother's actions. "And me, Thomas?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger and sorrow. "Don't I mean anything to you? How could you think I would steal?" Thomas looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know what to think, Emily. My mother is so sure of herself." It was too much. The pain in my chest turned to cold rage. I stood up, facing the man I thought I knew, the man I thought I loved. "Your mother is sure of herself?" I repeated, incredulous. "And me, Thomas? Are you not sure of me, of my integrity, of my love for you?" The cafe patrons were openly staring now, captivated by the unfolding drama. But I didn't care. All that mattered in that moment was Thomas and me and the chasm widening between us. "Emily, try to understand," Thomas pleaded. "This is a difficult situation for everyone. If you could just—" I didn't let him finish. "If I could what, Thomas? Confess to a crime I didn't commit, except being treated like a thief on my wedding day?" The tension was palpable. Sophie and my father sat rigidly, ready to intervene. The situation could explode at any moment, and then Thomas spoke the words that would change everything. Words I never thought I would hear from his mouth. "Maybe if you just confessed, we could work things out." he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Time seemed to stand still. I stared at Thomas, searching his eyes for the man I loved, the man I trusted. But all I saw was a stranger. Without thinking, my hand moved. The slap echoed through the cafe, startling the customers. Thomas took a step back, shock written on his face. His cheek reddened where my palm had struck him. "How dare you?" I cried, tears streaming freely. "How dare you ask me to confess to something I didn't do?" The silence was deafening. Thomas held his cheek, disbelief in his eyes. Then, in an instant, his expression changed. Surprise gave way to anger, an anger I had never seen in him before. What happened next would be burned into my memory forever. Thomas raised his hand. I saw the movement as if in slow motion, unable to react. Then, pain. It exploded across my cheek as his fist connected with my face. I staggered backward, barely caught by Sophie. Gasps and cries of indignation filled the cafe, their sounds muffled as if I were underwater. My father lunged at Thomas, pinning him against the wall. "You bastard!" my father roared, shaking him violently. "How dare you lay a hand on my daughter?" The cafe owner rushed forward, trying to separate them. "Out!" he shouted. "Everyone, get out before I call the police." Sophie was already guiding me toward the exit, shielding me from the curious and horrified gazes of the other customers. My father followed closely, casting one last murderous look at Thomas before slamming the cafe door behind us. Once outside, the reality of what had just happened hit me hard. The man I loved, the man I was going to marry, had hit me. Shock, pain, and betrayal swirled together in a storm of emotions I couldn't untangle. "We need to go to the hospital," Sophie said, examining my cheek, which was beginning to swell. But I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "I just want to go home." My father nodded, understanding my need to escape from this place, from these memories. He hailed a taxi, and soon we were driving through the streets of Paris, leaving behind the church, the cafe, and the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of my life. The journey unfolded in heavy silence. I stared out the window without really seeing the landscape. The lively streets of Paris, the crowded cafe terraces, the couples walking hand in hand, it all seemed to belong to another world, a world to which I no longer belonged. When we arrived home, Sophie helped me up the stairs. My legs were shaking, my body drained of all energy. Once inside my apartment, I headed straight to the bathroom. I needed to see for myself. The mirror reflected a stranger, a woman with red-rimmed eyes, smeared makeup, and a bruise already forming on her cheek. My wedding dress, a symbol of joy and hope, now felt like a cruel joke. I slowly took it off, letting the white fabric slide to my feet. Every movement reminded me of the pain, both physical and emotional. A gentle knock on the door. "Emily, do you need help?" Sophie's voice was soft, careful. "No," I replied, my voice unrecognizable. "I just need to be alone for a while." I heard her footsteps retreating, followed by the murmur of her conversation with my father in the living room. They were worried about me, I knew that. But in that moment, I couldn't face their worry or their pity. I stepped into the shower, letting the hot water cascade over my body. Tears mixed with the water, and I finally let go, giving in to my sorrow. How? How had we ended up here? How had love turned into something so ugly, so painful? When I finally emerged, wrapped in a bathrobe, I found Sophie and my father sitting in the living room. They jumped to their feet the moment they saw me, worry etched onto their faces. "My dear," my father began, "maybe we should file a complaint." But I shook my head. "No, Dad. Not now. I can't face this right now." He nodded, his understanding laced with the anger still burning in his eyes. Sophie stepped closer, gently pulling me into a hug. "I'll stay with you tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, grateful. The thought of facing this night alone terrified me more than I wanted to admit. That night, lying in bed, I listened to Sophie's steady breathing from the sofa. Sleep evaded me. My mind replayed the day over and over. Thomas's doubt, his mother's accusation, the slap, the blow. Each memory was a fresh wound, a dagger straight to my heart. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't let this day define the rest of my life. Yes, I had been a victim, but I refused to remain one. Somehow, I had to find the strength to move forward, to rebuild. With that resolution, sleep finally overtook me, a restless, uneasy sleep filled with fragmented dreams, but sleep nonetheless. And when I woke up, I would have to face a new day, a new reality, a reality where I was no longer a bride-to-be, but a woman, betrayed, hurt, but determined to stand back up. The next morning, I was awakened by a ray of sunlight peeking through the curtains. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. Then, the sharp pain in my cheek jolted me back to reality. The memories of the previous day crashed over me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. I sat up slowly, every movement requiring more effort than it should. My reflection in the dresser mirror made me wince. A deep purple bruise spread across my left cheek, a cruel testament to Thomas's betrayal. Sophie was still asleep on the sofa. Moving quietly, I slipped out of the bedroom, not wanting to wake her. In the kitchen, I turned on the coffee maker. The familiar hum, the rich aroma, small comforts in a morning that felt anything but normal. My phone sat on the counter, turned off since yesterday. It taunted me. At some point, I would have to turn it back on, face the world, answer the inevitable questions. But not now, not yet. The coffee dripped slowly, the scent filling the kitchen. I stared at the dark liquid, trying to gather my thoughts. What now? How was I supposed to explain this to my family, my friends, my colleagues? Shame and anger coiled inside me, leaving me exhausted before the day had even begun. Emily? Sophie's sleepy voice pulled me from my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her hair tousled, her face etched with concern. How are you feeling? I shrugged, unable to find the words. She stepped closer, wrapping me in a hug. In a silent embrace, this simple gesture of affection brought back the tears I'd been holding back since I woke up. I'm here, she whispered, rubbing my back gently. We're going to get through this together. We stayed like that for a moment, the silence of the kitchen broken only by the soft gurgling of the coffee maker. Finally, I slowly pulled away, wiping my eyes. Thanks for staying, I said, my voice hoarse from crying. Sophie gave me a sad smile. That's normal. That's what friends are for, right? We sat at the kitchen table, each with a steaming cup of coffee. The silence stretched between us, comfortable, yet full of unspoken words. Maybe you should see a doctor, Sophie suggested gently, nodding toward my cheek. I shook my head. It'll be okay. It's just a bruise. She frowned, visibly disagreeing, but didn't push. She knew when to hold back. What are you going to do now? She asked after a moment. That was the million-euro question. What was I going to do? My world had fallen apart in a single day. The future I had imagined, planned, had evaporated like smoke. I don't know, I finally admitted. I guess I'll have to cancel the honeymoon, tell the guests the wedding is off, face my family, my colleagues. The to-do list seemed endless, overwhelming. How was I supposed to explain what had happened? The truth felt too cruel, too humiliating to share. You don't have to do everything right away, Sophie said, placing a hand over mine. Take the time you need. I nodded, grateful for her understanding, but I knew I couldn't avoid reality forever. With a sigh, I reached for my phone. It was time to face the inevitable. The moment I turned it on, it vibrated frantically. Dozens of notifications flooded the screen. Missed calls, messages, emails. Most were from family and friends, worried about my silence. A few were from Thomas. My finger hovered over his name. Should I read his messages? What could he possibly have to say after what he had done? Before I could decide, my phone rang. My mother's name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello, Mom. Emily. My God. Finally. We were worried to death. What happened? Where are you? Her questions came in a panicked rush. I closed my eyes, searching for the strength to answer. I'm home, Mom, I said softly. I'm fine. It's just... The wedding is canceled. Silence. Then, in a hesitant voice, she asked, "Cancelled? But why? What happened, my darling?" I glanced at Sophie, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, I began recounting the events of the day before: Thomas's mother's accusation, his lack of faith in me, the argument at the cafe. When I reached the part where Thomas had hit me, my voice cracked. A shocked gasp came from the other end of the line. "Oh, darling," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll be right there." Despite my protests, she insisted. An hour later, she was at my door, her arms full of shopping bags. "I thought you might not want to go out," she explained, setting them on the kitchen counter. Her gaze lingered on my face, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. Without a word, she pulled me into a tight embrace, holding me like she used to when I was little. The day passed in a blur of phone calls and visits. My father arrived shortly after my mother, his face a mixture of anger and concern. My brothers called, offering to take care of Thomas, an offer I firmly declined despite the small vengeful voice inside me that found the idea tempting. Sophie stayed by my side, screening calls, managing visitors, making sure I ate and rested. She was the rock I clung to in the storm of my emotions. Toward the late afternoon, just as the weight of the day began to feel unbearable, my phone rang again. Thomas. The room seemed to freeze. My parents and Sophie looked at me, waiting for my reaction. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, unsure. "You don't have to answer," my father said softly, but I knew I had to. If I wanted to move forward, I had to face this. With a trembling hand, I answered, "Hello." "Emily," Thomas's voice was hoarse, as if he had been crying. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." "Stop," I interrupted him, surprising even myself with the strength in my voice. "You can't erase what you did with an apology, Thomas." Silence. Then, in a broken voice, he whispered, I know I ruined everything, but I have to see you." My heart lurched. What could he possibly have to say? A part of me wanted to hang up, to cut all ties, but another part, smaller, but insistent, wanted answers. "I don't think that's a good idea," I finally said. "Please, Emily," he pleaded. "Just once. After that, if you never want to see me again, I'll understand." I closed my eyes, weighing my options. Curiosity won out. "Okay," I conceded, "but not today, and not alone." We agreed to meet the next day at a cafe near my house. Sophie insisted on her manipulations, his desperate need for her approval. And yet, despite everything, he had still chosen her over me. Sophie accompanied me, and I accepted gratefully. After hanging up, I turned to my family and Sophie. Their faces reflected a mixture of concern and support. "Are you sure you want to see him?" my mother asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. I nodded. "I need to know. I need to understand why all this happened." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. What could Thomas possibly say? What excuse could justify what had happened? As dawn began to break, I gave up on sleep. I made myself a coffee and sat on the balcony, watching Pear slowly wake up. Whatever this day had in store for me, I knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. But maybe, just maybe, I would find the answers I needed to start healing. The day of my meeting with Thomas dawned gray and heavy, the Parisian sky mirroring my own unease. I prepared mechanically, choosing simple, comfortable clothes, so far from the wedding dress I should have been wearing on my honeymoon. Sophie arrived early, her face filled with worry and determination. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked for the 10th time. I nodded, unable to put into words the tangled mess of emotions inside me. Fear, anger, curiosity, and, somewhere, buried deep, a remnant of love. We headed toward the Café des Artistes, a quiet place Thomas and I used to frequent. As we approached, I realized how cruel this choice of location was, filled with happy memories that now clashed painfully with reality. Thomas was already there when we arrived, sitting at a table in the back. His pale, drawn face betrayed his lack of sleep. When he saw us, he stood awkwardly, hesitating. "Emily," he said softly, his eyes lingering on my face, on the still visible mark of his blow. Guilt and shame were written all over him. "Thomas," I replied coldly, sitting down without offering my hand. Sophie took the seat beside me, her presence a reassuring anchor. A heavy silence settled. The waiter came to take our orders, a welcome distraction. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I know I don't deserve for you to listen to me, but—" "Get to the point, Thomas," I interrupted. "You said you had something to tell me, so say it." He nodded, his hands playing nervously with his coffee cup. After what happened at the church and the cafe, I went home to my parents. I was lost, angry, confused, and then—" He paused, searching for words. I felt my heartbeat quicken, bracing myself. "I found the ring," he finally blurted out. The world seemed to stop. "What?" I whispered, incredulous. "My grandmother's emerald ring," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my mother's room. She had just misplaced it." A wave of anger surged inside me, hot and uncontrollable. "Lost?" I repeated, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "She accused me of stealing, ruined our wedding, our future, because she misplaced her ring." Thomas looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I should have believed you. I should have." "Yes, you should have," I exploded, attracting stares from nearby tables. "But I didn't care. You should have trusted me. You should have defended me. Instead, you—" My voice failed me, the weight of his betrayal choking me. Memories of his slap flashed through my mind, reigniting the pain and humiliation. Sophie placed a soothing hand on my arm. "Calm down, Emily," she whispered before turning to Thomas. "And your mother. What did she say when you found the ring?" Thomas's face twisted with shame. She refused to admit her mistake. She said she must have put it there and forgotten, but that Emily could have taken it and put it back. I couldn't believe my ears. Even with proof in front of her, she still refused to admit she was wrong, I asked, incredulous. Thomas shook his head vigorously. "No, of course not. I had a huge argument with her. I told her her behavior was unacceptable, that she had destroyed our wedding, our happiness." He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "I left their house. I haven't spoken to them since." A heavy silence settled at our table. I stared at my coffee cup, trying to process everything. Part of me felt relief. My innocence had been proven. But a much larger part remained hurt, broken. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you believe me from the start?" Thomas lifted his gaze, filled with remorse. "I wish I had a good answer for you, Emily. The truth is, I was a coward. I've always had trouble standing up to my mother. You know that. And that day when she accused you, I panicked. I should have trusted you. I should have remembered everything we had been through together. But I let fear and doubt take over." His words struck a painful chord. Memories resurfaced. Memories of the times I had encouraged him to stand up to his mother, of his discomfort under her control, of his desperate need for her approval. And despite everything, despite all those moments, he had still chosen her over me. Thomas interrupted my thoughts. "That's not an excuse," he said firmly. "Nothing can excuse what I did. Hitting you. It's unforgivable. I will never forgive myself." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "You're right," I said softly. "This is unforgivable." Thomas nodded, accepting my words. "I know. I didn't come here to ask you to forgive me, Emily. I just wanted you to know the truth. You deserve at least that." We sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. Around us, the cafe hummed with life. The clinking of cups, the quiet murmur of conversations, a stark contrast to the personal wreckage between us. "What are you going to do now?" Sophie asked, breaking the silence. Thomas shrugged. "I don't really know. I took leave from work. I think I need to step back, think about everything. Maybe see a therapist. I never want to be that man again." the man who raised his hand against the woman he loves. His words touched me more than I wanted to admit. Despite everything, a small part of me felt relief that he understood the gravity of his actions. "And you, Emily?" he asked softly. "What are you going to do?" I took a deep breath, realizing I hadn't truly thought about it. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, leaving me little time to consider the future. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I have to officially cancel the wedding, inform the guests, and then there's work. I have no idea how I'll explain all of this." "I can help," Thomas offered. "With the cancellations, I mean." I hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but I want Sophie to handle things. I'm not ready to have more contact with you right now." Thomas nodded in understanding. "Of course, I get it." As our meeting neared its end, I felt strangely empty. The truth should have given me closure, a sense of justice, but instead all I felt was exhaustion, tired and sad for everything that had been lost. We stood up, the air heavy with unspoken words and regret. As we turned to leave, Thomas made a slight movement as if to touch me but pulled back at the last moment. "I'm really sorry, Emily," he said one last time, "for everything." I looked at him, the man I had loved, the man I thought I knew. Despite the pain and anger, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity. "Goodbye, Thomas," I said simply before turning away. Sophie and I left the cafe, leaving behind not just Thomas but the broken remnants of what should have been our future together. As we walked through the streets of Paris, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was finally out. My name had been cleared, but I knew that healing would take time. Broken trust, shattered dreams, physical and emotional pain. None of it would disappear overnight. And yet, for the first time since that fateful day in the church, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe one day I could look back at this not as the end of everything, but as the beginning of a new chapter. The days following my meeting with Thomas passed in a fog of reflection and introspection. Knowing the truth about the ring brought some relief, but it also forced me to confront difficult questions about my future. Every morning I woke up with an aching emptiness, as if I were floating between my old life and a new one I couldn't yet imagine. True to her promise, Sophie took care of the wedding cancellations, calling the guests, the caterer, the florist, sparing me the pain of repeating the story over and over. I was endlessly grateful to her, even if each update felt like a fresh wound. One morning, as I sipped coffee on my balcony, watching Paris wake up, my phone vibrated. A message from Thomas. "I started therapy. I know it doesn't change what I did, but I wanted you to know. Take care of yourself, Emily." I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure how to react. A part of me was relieved that he was seeking help, acknowledging his issues. But another part of me remained skeptical. Was this genuine growth or just an attempt to regain my sympathy? That message was the catalyst I needed to start thinking seriously about my own future. Until then, I had been in survival mode, handling each day as it came. But now, I needed to make decisions. I decided to take a few days off. My boss, understanding of my situation, agreed without hesitation. "Take the time you need, Emily," he told me. "Your job will be here when you're ready." On my first day off, I went to the Luxembourg Gardens, a place where Thomas and I had once walked, dreaming about our future. Today I went alone, a notebook in hand, determined to organize my thoughts. Sitting on a bench facing the grand fountain, I began to write. My fears, my pain, my hopes, everything poured onto the page in an uninterrupted flow, and for the first time I realized how much I needed this moment, this catharsis. Over the writing, one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. Even if Thomas went to therapy, even if he changed, the trust had been irreparably broken. The blow he had dealt me had left a much deeper scar than the one, now almost faded, on my cheek. On the second day, I met my mother for lunch. We sat on the terrace of a small bistro soaking in the spring sun. "How are you really, darling?" she asked, her eyes scanning my face with concern. I took a deep breath. "Better, I think. I'm starting to see things more clearly." She nodded, encouraging me to continue. I think I can't forgive Thomas, I said slowly. At least not now. Maybe never. My mother took my hand in hers. That's normal, Emily. What he did is serious. You don't have to forgive him. Her words comforted me more than I expected. Knowing that I had permission, not to forgive, not to try to salvage something that had hurt me so deeply, was liberating. What are you planning to do now? She asked. I thought for a moment before answering. I think I need a change. Maybe take a sabbatical, travel a little. The idea had started forming the day before when I had absent-mindedly flipped through a travel magazine. A photo of a white sand beach in Seychelles had made me dream of escaping, of starting over. My mother smiled. I think that's a great idea. You need to find yourself, to rebuild, away from all this. On the third day, I met Sophie at our favorite cafe. I told her about my decision, my desire to leave. I'm proud of you, Emily, she said, hugging me. You're taking care of yourself. That's what matters most. We spent the afternoon exploring potential destinations, dreaming of adventures and new horizons. For the first time in a long time, I was surprised to feel excitement, to look toward the future with hope. On the fourth day, I returned to work, having made my decision. In my boss's office, I took a deep breath before speaking. I'd like to take a sabbatical, I announced. I need to step back, to travel. My boss listened carefully, nodding in understanding. I think that's a wise decision, Emily. How long do you plan to be away? 6 months, I replied, surprised by my own boldness. If that's possible, of course. To my relief, he agreed without hesitation. You're a valuable employee, Emily. Take the time you need. Your position will be here when you return. Gratitude and relief washed over me. That conversation marked the concrete start of my new chapter. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. I finally chose Seychelles as my first destination, with the idea of exploring other places afterward. Sophie helped me plan my route, her excitement mirroring my own, as if she were the one leaving. A week after my meeting with Thomas, I found myself in front of him once again. This time, I had asked to see him. We met in a park, neutral ground. I'm leaving, I announced without preamble. I took a sabbatical. I'm traveling for 6 months. Thomas looked at me, a flicker of sadness in his eyes, but also understanding. I understand, he said slowly. You need this. I nodded. Yes. I need to heal. A silence settled between us, heavy with things left unsaid. I'm sorry, Emily, he said finally, for everything. I hope you can forgive me. I looked at him, the man I had once loved, the man I had thought I knew. Despite the lingering pain and anger, a strange sense of peace filled me. Maybe one day, I said slowly, but not now. Right now, I need to focus on myself. We parted on those words, a page permanently turning in both of our lives. The day of my departure arrived quickly. On the train platform, ready to head to the airport, I was surrounded by my family and Sophie. The goodbyes were emotional but filled with hope and excitement. Take care, my darling, my mother whispered, holding me tightly. Enjoy every moment, but don't forget to check in, my father added with a smile. Sophie was the last to hug me. I'm going to miss you so much, she whispered. But I'm so proud of you. As I boarded the train, my bag slung over my shoulder, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Light. The future was uncertain, but it was mine. I had made my decision, choosing to focus on myself, my healing, and my personal growth. The train slowly pulled away from the station. I looked out the window, watching Paris fade into the distance. A part of me felt sadness, leaving behind so many memories, both good and bad. But another, stronger part of me was filled with hope and anticipation. I didn't know what these 6 months would bring me. I didn't know who I would be when I returned. But I knew one thing. I had made the right decision. This journey was the first step toward rebuilding myself, toward becoming a stronger, wiser Emily, ready to embrace life with a fresh perspective. As the landscape rolled past, I pulled out my journal and began to write. Not about the past this time, but about the future, about my hopes, my dreams, the things I wanted to accomplish. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free, mistress of my own destiny, and my journey was just beginning. The sun of Seychelles warmed my skin as I woke, gently rocked by the sound of the waves. It had been a month since I left Paris, a month since leaving behind a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. Each morning, as I opened my eyes to this earthly paradise, I felt a little lighter, a little more like myself. The first days had been difficult. Despite the breathtaking beauty of the island, I felt lost, disoriented. The jet lag was just an excuse for the real gap I felt, the one between the life I had imagined and the one I was now living. But little by little, I started opening myself up to this new reality. I spent my days exploring the island, getting lost in its lush forests, swimming in its crystal clear waters. Each evening, sitting on the beach, I watched the sunset over the Indian Ocean, its fiery colors taking a little more of my pain with them. It was during one of those evenings that I met Luc, a French photographer who had been traveling the world for years. We started talking, sharing our travel experiences and stories. Without even realizing it, I found myself telling him mine. The wedding that never happened, the betrayal, the violence. Luc listened without judgment, simply offering an attentive ear and a shoulder to cry on. That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Talking to a stranger, someone who didn't know Thomas or my life in Paris, had a cathartic effect I hadn't anticipated. In the following days, Luc and I continued to see each other. He introduced me to photography, teaching me how to capture the island's beauty through a lens. I discovered a new passion, a way to express what I felt without needing words. One evening, as we sorted through the day's photos, Luc looked at me with an enigmatic smile. "You know, Emily," he said, "I think you should consider extending your trip." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression remained serious. "I'm serious," he continued. "I have a friend who runs a diving center in Thailand. He's looking for someone to help with administration and communication. It could be a great opportunity for you." At first, the idea seemed crazy. Me, in Thailand, working at a diving center. It was light years away from my Parisian life in finance. But the more I thought about it, the more the idea took hold. Wasn't this exactly what I needed? A chance to completely reinvent myself, far from everything that reminded me of my old life. After several days of reflection and long conversations with Sophie over Skype, I made my decision. I was going to do it. I was going to extend my sabbatical and leave for Thailand. The day I left Seychelles was both bittersweet and exciting. I said goodbye to Luc, thanking him for his friendship and for opening my eyes to new possibilities. He made me promise to send him photos from my adventures in Thailand. Arriving in Bangkok was a culture shock, the spicy scents, the constant noise, the humid heat. Everything was so different from what I knew. But strangely, I felt at home in this organized chaos. The diving center was on a small island in southern Thailand. As soon as I arrived, I was welcomed by Mark, Luc's friend, a French expatriate who had lived there for over 10 years. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself smiling more than I had in months. The first weeks were intense. I learned the basics of diving while managing the center's administration. It was demanding but rewarding work. Each evening, exhausted yet satisfied, I fell asleep to the sound of the waves, a sense of peace settling over me. Little by little, I felt like I was becoming whole again. One day while working on the center's website, Mark approached me with an unexpected proposal. "Emily," he said, "I saw the photos you took. They're really good. Would you be interested in using them for our new brochure?" I was surprised, flattered. Luc's lessons had paid off, but I had never imagined my photos being used professionally. It was the start of a new adventure. In addition to my administrative work, I began documenting life at the diving center. I photographed divers, vibrant fish, coral reefs. Each shot reminded me of how beautiful and unexpected life could be. The months passed and I realized I no longer wanted to return to Paris. My life here, simple yet fulfilling, gave me a sense of happiness I had never imagined. One evening, sitting on the beach, watching the sunset, I took out my phone and dialed the number of my former boss in Paris. "Hello, Jean-Pierre," I said when he answered. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Emily, what a pleasure to hear from you. How's your trip going?" I took a deep breath. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I don't think I'm coming back to Paris." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "I see," he said finally. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I replied, surprised by my own certainty. "I've found something here, a life that suits me. I know it's unexpected, but—" "Emily," he interrupted gently, "you don't have to justify yourself. I'm happy for you. You deserve this happiness." His words touched me deeply. After hanging up, I sat there for a long time staring at the ocean, reflecting on the path I had taken. The next day, I called my family and Sophie to tell them about my decision. They were surprised, of course, but also incredibly understanding and supportive. "You look happy, darling," my mother said. "That's all that matters to us." Sophie, true to herself, was already planning her visit. "You don't seriously think I'm going to let you live this dream alone, do you?" she joked. The weeks that followed were filled with change. I found a small bungalow near the beach, began learning Thai, and invested myself even more in my work at the diving center. One evening, while sorting through my photos of the day, I stumbled upon an old picture of me and Thomas. I was surprised to find that the pain I had expected to feel was absent. Instead, there was only a quiet melancholy, almost gratitude. Without that painful experience, I would never have had the courage to leave everything behind, to truly discover myself. I picked up my journal and began writing as I had done every night since leaving Paris. But this time, instead of dwelling on the past, I wrote about the future, about my plans to develop my photography skills, my desire to explore more islands in the region, and the peace I'd found here. As I closed my journal, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was truly happy. Not in a dazzling, overwhelming way, but in a quiet, deep, and peaceful way. The journey had been long and difficult, but I had finally found my place. Here, on this little Thai island, I had found more than just a fresh start. I had found a new version of myself, stronger, wiser, ready to embrace life in all its complexity. As I drifted off to sleep that night, lulled by the sound of the waves, I smiled. Tomorrow would be a new day, filled with new adventures, new challenges, and I was ready to face them, one photo at a time. If there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's that life rarely goes as planned. The dreams we build, the people we trust, the futures we envision, sometimes they crumble in an instant. But I've also learned that from the ruins we can rebuild. Pain does not define us unless we let it. The hardest moments often lead to the most profound transformations. If you ever find yourself lost, betrayed, or broken, know that it's not the end. It's a turning point. Give yourself permission to walk away from what no longer serves you. Take risks. Embrace the unknown. Sometimes the life you were meant to live is waiting just beyond your fear. And above all, never forget that happiness isn't always loud. It can be quiet, steady, and deeply fulfilling. Trust yourself. Keep moving forward. The best chapters of your life are still unwritten. Good luck, and thank you for listening to my story.